Rain was coming down hard on 5th Street the night everything changed. The kind of rain that turns headlights into blurred hollows and makes strangers duck under the same awning without looking at each other. I was standing outside a small Italian restaurant called Vittorio's, soaked through my jacket, waiting for a table I didn't have a reservation for, because my actual plans that night had fallen apart 2 hours earlier, when my best friend canceled on our dinner. I didn't feel like going home to an empty apartment and a sink full of dishes, so I told myself I'd treat myself to a decent meal alone. That was the whole plan. Just me, a plate of pasta, and 40 minutes of pretending I wasn't lonely. The hostess, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and kind, tired eyes, looked at me like she already knew something. I didn't. She said there was a table free, but only one, near the back, already set for 2. I told her I was alone. She smiled in a way that felt like she'd heard that sentence 1,000 times and didn't quite believe it applied to me tonight. She led me to the table anyway. I hadn't even taken off my jacket when a woman rushed in from the rain, hair dripping, cheeks flushed from the cold, scanning the room like she was looking for someone specific. Her eyes landed on me, and something in her face shifted from anxious to relieved in less than a second. She walked straight toward my table, and before I could say a word, she said, "I am so sorry I'm late. The trains were a mess." Then she sat down across from me, shook the rain from her coat, and smiled like she'd known me for years. Her name, I would learn a few minutes later, was Emily. She had short dark hair, a scar above her eyebrow she never explained, and a voice that made even nervous rambling sound like music. I should have corrected her right then. I should have said, "I think you have the wrong table," and let her go find whoever she was actually supposed to meet. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the loneliness sitting heavy in my chest, or maybe it was just the way she looked at me, like I was exactly who she needed to see. Whatever it was, I said nothing. I just smiled back and said, "No trouble at all. The food's better when you're a little late anyway." She talked for the first 10 minutes without stopping, filling the silence the way people do when they're nervous. She told me about her sister setting her up on this date, about how she almost didn't come because she'd had a long week, about how she'd worn the wrong shoes for the rain and now her feet were freezing. I listened, nodding, asking small questions, terrified that at any moment she'd realize I wasn't who she thought I was. But she never did. Not that night. We ordered wine, then pasta, then dessert we didn't need but ate anyway because neither of us wanted the night to end. She asked me questions any first date would ask. Where did I grow up? What did I do for work? Did I have siblings? And I answered honestly, because lying about who I was would have felt worse than the lie I was already living. I told her I was a high school English teacher, which was true. I told her I grew up in a small town outside Sacramento, which was true. The only thing I never said out loud was that I wasn't the man named Daniel she was supposed to be meeting. Somewhere between the wine and the dessert, I stopped worrying about being caught. I started just being there, fully, in a way I hadn't been present with another person in a long time. She laughed at something I said and covered her mouth like she was embarrassed by her own laugh. And I remember thinking that was the most honest sound I'd heard all year. She told me about her job at a small publishing house, how she edited manuscripts for a living but secretly wanted to write her own book someday. I told her that sounded less like a secret and more like a plan waiting for courage. She looked at me for a long moment after that, like I'd said something she needed to hear. The restaurant emptied out around us. Waiters started stacking chairs at other tables, and the hostess who had seated me kept glancing our way with a small, knowing smile as if she understood exactly what kind of mistake she'd made, or maybe exactly what kind of gift she'd given. Emily didn't notice any of it. She was too busy telling me about a trip she'd taken to Portugal 2 years ago, about how she'd stood on a cliff overlooking the ocean and felt, for the first time in her adult life, completely unafraid of being alone. I asked her why she'd agreed to a blind date if she liked being alone so much. She thought about it for a second, twirling her fork against the empty plate, and said that being alone and being lonely weren't the same thing. And lately, the second one had been creeping in more than she wanted to admit. She said her sister meant well, always trying to set her up, but most of the dates felt like job interviews, all resume and no real conversation. She looked up at me then and said this one felt different. She said I felt different. That was the moment guilt finally caught up with me. I opened my mouth to tell her the truth that I wasn't Daniel, that somewhere out there a man was probably standing outside the restaurant, confused, maybe checking his phone, wondering where his date had gone. But before I could get the words out, she reached across the table and touched my hand, just briefly, just enough to steal the sentence right out of my mouth. She said she was glad her sister had finally gotten one right, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't take that smile off her face. We stayed until the restaurant was ready to close. The waiter dropped the check with an apologetic look, and I paid it before she could reach for her wallet. telling myself it was the least I could do for a night I had no right to be part of. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist, and the streetlights turned the wet pavement gold. She stood close to me under the small awning, arms crossed against the cold, and asked if I wanted to walk her to the train station. I said yes before I could think of a reason to say no. We walked slowly, in no hurry, talking about nothing important. Her favorite bookstore, the terrible coffee at her office, the way New York smelled different after it rained. At the station entrance, she turned to face me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then she asked for my number, said she wanted to see me again, said this was the first date in a long time that hadn't felt like a performance. I gave her my real number. That part, at least, was true. She disappeared down the stairs into the station, waving once before the crowd swallowed her, and I stood there in the cold for a long time after she was gone, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, the specific, terrifying joy of wanting to see someone again, tangled together with the dread of what I'd have to tell her before I could. 2 days passed before she texted. Her message was simple. She said she'd had a wonderful time and hoped I felt the same. I stared at my phone for almost an hour before I finally typed out the truth, deleting it and rewriting it 4 different times. In the end, I just told her plainly. I told her my name wasn't Daniel. I told her I'd been sitting at that table because I was alone and hadn't meant to end up in the middle of someone else's evening, and that by the time I realized what was happening, I hadn't wanted it to stop. I told her I understood if she never wanted to speak to me again, and that I was sorry for letting the lie live as long as it did. She didn't respond for 3 days. Those 3 days were some of the longest of my life. I kept replaying the dinner in my head, wondering if I'd imagined the way she'd looked at me, wondering if the whole night had only felt real because I'd wanted it to be. I told myself I deserved the silence. I'd built an entire evening on a mistake I chose not to correct, and no apology could undo that. On the 4th day, she called instead of texting. Her voice was steady, not angry the way I expected. She said she'd needed the time to think, not because she was furious, but because she couldn't decide if she should be. She said Daniel had texted her the next morning, confused, asking why she never showed up to the restaurant. And that was how she'd first realized something strange had happened. She said her first instinct was embarrassment, then anger, then something more complicated that took her days to name. In the end, she said, she kept coming back to one simple fact. The man across from her that night, whoever he really was, had been the most honest version of a stranger she'd ever spent an evening with. Lie and all, she said everything else about that dinner had felt true, even if my name at that table hadn't been. We met again a week later, this time on purpose, at a small coffee shop near her office, both of us nervous in a completely different way than before. There was no pretending this time, no mistaken identity to hide behind, just 2 people deciding whether the connection they'd felt could survive, being fully seen. It was harder than the first night, more awkward in places, full of careful questions and long pauses. But it was real, and real things are allowed to be a little clumsy. Somewhere in that conversation, over lukewarm coffee, she told me she didn't fully understand why she wasn't more upset with me, and I told her I didn't fully understand it either, only that I was grateful for it. She said that grandmother from the restaurant, the one who'd whispered something to the hostess before I arrived, apparently used to do this on quiet nights, seating strangers together just to see what would happen, treating loneliness like something curable if you just gave 2 people a table and enough time. She'd found this out from the hostess herself, who'd finally admitted the truth when Emily went back to ask about the man who'd been at her table. That small, strange kindness from a woman we never even spoke to became the beginning of everything that followed. Emily and I dated for 8 months after that coffee, slowly, honestly, learning each other the right way instead of the accidental way we'd started. There were fights, ordinary ones, about time and distance, and the small frictions of 2 independent lives learning to fit together. There were also mornings I'll never forget, quiet ones, where she'd read manuscripts on my couch while I graded papers, both of us content in a silence that never once felt lonely. I won't pretend the ending was some perfect fairy tale forever, because life rarely writes it that clean. We didn't end up married, and eventually, gently, we grew into different directions, the way some relationships do even when nothing was ever wrong between them. But when we finally let each other go, almost 2 years later, it wasn't with anger or regret. It was with the quiet gratitude of 2 people who had given each other exactly what they needed at exactly the right moment, and who both knew it. The last time I saw Emily, she told me something I still think about. She said that night at Vittorio's had taught her that the best things in her life rarely arrived the way she'd planned them, and that she'd stopped being afraid of the wrong tables, the wrong trains, the wrong turns, because sometimes those mistakes were just life's clumsy way of introducing you to something you needed. She said she still wasn't sure if I'd been the right man for the rest of her life, But she was certain I'd been the right stranger for that one particular night, and that some nights are enough on their own to matter forever. I think about that dinner sometimes, especially on rainy evenings when the city smells like wet pavement and neon. I think about the choice I made in that first silent second, when I could have told her the truth and let her go, looking for the man she actually came to meet. I've never regretted staying quiet, not because the lie was right, but because it led both of us somewhere honest in the end. Somewhere neither of us would have found if I'd simply corrected a stranger's mistake and let the evening end before it ever really began. I wasn't her blind date. I never was. But for one rain-soaked night in a small Italian restaurant on 5th Street, I got to be exactly what she needed. And by the time dessert arrived, I wished with everything in me that I really was.